Happy Friday, everyone. Thanks for joining us on Business Daily. I'm Lee-Jun in Seoul. We have a lot of stories lined up for you today, so let's get started with the check on the day's highlights. As widely expected, the Bank of Korea freezes its key interest rate for a fifth consecutive month as it stays cautious amid growing uncertainties both at home and abroad. Now that Donald Trump is getting ready to lead the United States, what changes can we expect from his presidency as the world's biggest economy steps closer to protectionism? These stories and more coming right up. Korea's central bank has kept its key rate steady at 1.25% for November, as policymakers measured the impact of a wealth of uncertainties at home and abroad. Our Shin Se-min reports from the Bank of Korea.
The Bank of Korea chose to stand pat on its monthly policy decision, leaving the key rate at 1.25% with mounting uncertainties at home and abroad, pushing the central bank into a zone of caution. With that, the BOK has kept rates on hold for a fifth consecutive month. The wait-and-see approach comes on the back of an unexpected new U.S. president-elect, Donald Trump.
The U.S. presidential results were largely unexpected by the markets, so unpredictability has surged, with some even unsure about the potential of policy changes. Although it's difficult to measure the exact impact this will have on our economy, we'll carefully monitor the situation and counteract accordingly.
The top central banker speculated that it's highly likely the Federal Reserve will pursue its December rate hike, although questions on what changes will be seen in the country's economic policies remain largely unanswered. Adding to this variable, Korea's abuse of power scandal at home involving President Park Geun-hye and her confidant Choi Soon-sil has slammed the brakes on state affairs, giving the BOK more reason to exercise caution. Market watchers say a combination of these uncertainties and expectations for more fiscal spending under a Trump president in the U.S. will give Korea some relief from its household debt problem. This especially as the government looks to contain the overheating property market.
Considering higher expectations for economic growth in the U.S., it's likely that under a Trump administration, the Fed will only raise rates once next year, after a December hike. That could give Korea some time to see government measures take effect.
Adding that it's still unclear whether Trump's campaign promises will directly translate into policies, experts say that local financial authorities in the meantime should devise more ways to slow the growing household debt pile. Shin Se-min, Business Daily.
And the government has vowed to keep close tabs on the financial market following Donald Trump's unexpected presidential victory over in the U.S. Speaking with economy-related officials this morning, Vice Finance Minister Choi Sang-mok said the markets were showing signs of stabilization. Major markets in Asia rebounded on Thursday, following overnight gains on Wall Street on the back of Trump's speech calling for unity and an expected pickup in the U.S. economy. The officials, however, did not rule out the possibility of further market volatility given uncertainties over President-elect Trump's policies. They said they would step up monitoring of local and global markets and take extra stabilization measures if necessary. And moving on to markets, to give us a wrap-up of this week's stock market action, we have our Business Daily's markets contributor, Choi Jin-seok, joining us on the phone today. Hello, Jin-seok.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so we had a roller coaster week because of the U.S. presidential election. With that, how are things looking on the last day of trading?
On Friday, the Kospi market fell by 0.9% to close at 1984.43, while the Kosdaq failed to remain in positive territory, closing at 621.89, down 0.22% compared to the previous session. The country's tech sector dragged down both indexes of the Korean equity market. Despite the fact that the Korean won dropped significantly, major exporters fell due to concerns over trade protectionism under a Trump presidency. Foreign investors were the only net sellers on the Kospi market, with uncertainty surrounding the U.S. Federal Reserve's potential interest rate hike in December, hurting sentiment among foreigners.
Now, getting back to the extreme volatility we saw throughout the week, how was the overall weekly performance?
On a weekly basis, the Kospi rose slightly while the Kosdaq surged by more than 1%. Institutional investors who bought massive amounts of shares during the week helped lift the Korean equity market. After falling early this week, both indexes rebounded sharply yesterday as investors continued to revise their strategies and reposition portfolios in response to Trump's victory.
And as we've seen over the past couple of days, global stock markets now seem to see Trump's victory as a positive catalyst. But analysts are still calling for caution. Why is that?
Right. As you mentioned, global stock markets all bounced back from the so-called Trump-led market crash. Some of the reasons being, first, global investors do not think Trump will take extreme measures after he takes office. Second, Trump's push for loose fiscal policy and more infrastructure investments raised expectations for an economic boost. In other words, there's a belief this all could trigger more inflation if he implements his policies as announced. But experts advise investors not to have such high expectations. A new president can reverse inflation trends without improvements in the real economy. In addition, Trump's victory can raise uncertainty surrounding the U.S. rate hike schedule because he doesn't seem to pursue policy continuity. This has been Trending Up for the Business Daily.
For many Koreans in their 50s and 60s, the real fun might just be starting. Despite the slow economy, this consumer group has emerged as one of the biggest spenders, prompting industries to better cater to their needs. Our Lee Joo-young has more.
58-year-old Song Eun-sun says life is so much more fun these days compared to when she was in her 30s and 40s. After starting her own cafe last year in September, she's been running the place with her children while making time for her weekly arts and writing classes in the neighborhood.
I've actually studied fine arts, so I enjoy going to art galleries and collecting art as well as drawing. I wanted to do all these things when I was younger, but I had my hands full with the family. Now that my children are grown up, I have the time and money to do things like buying artworks. I feel like now I'm being compensated for what I didn't have until my mid-50s.
While elderly poverty is still one of the country's most pressing issues, on the other side of the coin, there are people like Song who are considered so-called active seniors. Typically, they're highly educated people in their 50s and 60s and have secured a certain level of wealth, enabling them to spend time and money on themselves. According to Korea's largest research firm Hankuk Research, the average credit card spending of these seniors amounted to roughly $1,500 a month, at nearly $400 more than those in their 30s and 40s. Older consumers have also emerged as big spenders in the tourism industry, no longer satisfied with trips to close countries like Japan and China. Travel agency Tour Paksa says people in their 50s and 60s who visited the U.S. and Europe last year rose by 5 percentage points each from 2014, outpacing younger age groups. With projections that Korea's senior-related market is set to reach up to $128 billion in 2020, experts say the market holds potential even for exports.
I actually want to export K-aging like K-pop. This country has an advantage. Our medical standards are pretty high. And if we fuse that with tourism and IT, I believe we can develop ideas that can be exported to developed countries.
Senior education is also considered a lucrative field.
I asked a 94-year-old person what he wants to do, and he said he wants to study English. I believe the market for senior education also has huge potential. We need to keep unearthing these ideas.
With Koreans in their 50s currently holding about 61% of the country's total assets, there are growing calls to further develop industries related to the elderly to better cater to a rapidly growing aging population still young at heart. Lee Joo-young, Business Daily.
It's Friday, and that means it's time for a look through some of the important global business stories from the week. And for that, we're now joined by our Eunice Kim in the studio. Hi, Eunice.
Happy Friday.
All right, so without a doubt, the biggest news of the week is obviously the surprising U.S. presidential election win by Donald Trump.
Yeah, absolutely. What a surprise it was, right? Donald Trump claiming that needed 270 electoral votes with a stunning upset victory in the state of Wisconsin this week. It was an emotional result for either sides of the aisle. But despite this shock, the transition process is well underway in the world's largest economy.
They may have been the fiercest of enemies during the bitter campaign season. But just 2 days after one of the most divisive U.S. presidential elections in recent memory came to an end, President-elect Donald Trump was given a cordial welcome to the White House on Thursday local time.
This was a meeting that was going to last for maybe 10 or 15 minutes, and we were just going to get to know each other. We had never met each other. I have great respect. We discussed a lot of different situations, some wonderful and some difficulties. I very much look forward to dealing with the president in the future, including counsel.
We talked about some of the organizational issues in setting up a White House. We talked about foreign policy. We talked about domestic policy. And as I said last night, my number one priority in the coming 2 months is to try to facilitate a transition that ensures our president-elect is successful.
After clinching more than 270 electoral votes this week, Donald Trump will move into the White House in January to become the 45th president of the United States. So what could his 4-year term look like?
I have the feeling that he's going to delegate a great deal to his staff, which is something that George W. Bush did also, and that generated a great deal of infighting. I would imagine that the Trump administration will see a lot of empire building by staff around him.
Political scientist Robert Kelly says he expects to see an easing of Obama-era fiscal restraint, as the outsider president-elect has promised spending in infrastructure and defense. That he would follow through pushed the Dow to record highs on Thursday. But the question is, how will he be able to pull that off amid a promised tax cut?
Trump may posture as an outsider, but the people around him, people like Rudy Giuliani and Chris Christie and Newt Gingrich, have all been in this racket, this business, for a long time. In the past, the Republicans, quite honestly, under George W. Bush, have simply borrowed in order to fund both of those things. The deficit exploded under George W. Bush. I would imagine that it will go back up under Donald Trump, and that will raise all kinds of new issues about budgeteering.
So there are still a lot of unknowns as to what we can expect from a Trump presidency. But the surprise this week was the global rally.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, one of the biggest concerns that had immediately emerged following news of the Trump's win originated from Japan. Now, as we reported this week, we saw the Japanese yen, a safe haven asset, soar against the greenback, touching 101 yen amid this spike in uncertainty. What would a Trump presidency mean for America and the world economy? But, you know, things have been changing quite drastically as we are now seeing the yen actually dropping to a 3.5-month low as investors, number one, now know who the next U.S. president will be. And also, two, they are becoming optimistic, perhaps cautiously optimistic, about possible fiscal stimulus that could be coming out of the U.S. in the years to come. And across the Pacific Ocean, this could be good news for Bank of Japan Governor Haruhiko Kuroda, as he has been, battling a rising yen. In fact, Donald Trump had included mention of infrastructure investment in his early morning acceptance speech, showing priority there. And his transition team, in fact, has promised to put $550 billion toward building new roads and cities. And they're also hoping that by cutting taxes and lowering regulations, people will begin spending again. Now, the fact that both houses of Congress went to Republicans this week, with House Speaker Paul Ryan attributing that surprise sweep to the Trump momentum, people are perhaps cautiously optimistic that there could be more of a spirit of cooperation than we saw with Obama and a Republican Congress.
Right. And also, chances of a Fed rate hike in December, according to analysts, are also back up. But still, we are concerned about stuff on trade.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you spoke earlier, we, of course, are on alert here in Korea. But over in Japan, there is real concern as to the fate of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Pact, since that is a big part of Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's plan to improve Japan's GDP. And while the global credit rating agency S&P came out this week following the presidential announcement to affirm its investment grade rating on the U.S. With a nod to America's, quote, long-standing institutional strengths and robust checks and balances, that does not take away from the protectionist trade sentiment in the United States, nor Washington's, quote, high general government debt. So definitely watch this space.
So a lot to keep our eyes on as Donald Trump gets ready for his inauguration in January, I guess.
And we will definitely be watching.
Thank you so much for coming in today.
Sure thing.
And that wraps it up for today and this week. Thanks so much for watching. We'll be back next week with more business news that matters to you. Until then, goodbye.